We tell ourselves stories to make sense of the world. We like stories with clear heroes. We like stories where the good guys win because they were virtuous, because they had the moral high ground. And the story of the American century, the story of how the United States became the single most dominant power in human history, well, that is usually told as a story of destiny, of a unique American spirit, of industrial genius that just couldn't be held back. We see the footage of the 1950s in glorious Technicolor, the chrome-plated Cadillacs, the suburban lawns, the refrigerators stocked with food, the unmatched prosperity. It feels almost inevitable, like America was just destined to run the world. But if you look closer at that shining city on a hill, you realize the foundation is a little darker than the high school history books admit. We need to have a very honest, very uncomfortable conversation, because the truth is, America didn't become the undisputed master of the globe simply because it was better or smarter, or because it worked harder than everyone else. America became a superpower because the rest of the world burned down, literally. This isn't a comfortable idea. It suggests that America's golden age wasn't just built on American dreams. It was built on the ashes of European nightmares. Think about it for a moment. Before 1939, the world was a crowded place. You had the British Empire covering a quarter of the globe. You had France. You had a rising Germany, the Soviet Union, Japan. It was a multipolar world. Power was shared. It was fractured. 6 years later, 1945, the stage was empty. The cities of the old world were smoking ruins. The empires were bankrupt. The populations were starving, except for one giant unscathed player standing amidst the rubble. Today, we are going to look at the brutal economic physics of World War II. We are going to dismantle the mythology, and we are going to see how the total annihilation of Europe became the battery that charged the American Empire. Segment 1. The myth of the sleeping giant. To understand the ascent, we first have to understand the baseline. There is this idea that America was always a juggernaut. But let's rewind to 1938. The United States was not a superpower. Not really. It was a nation paralyzed by the Great Depression. Unemployment was still massive. Factories were sitting idle. The military was tiny, believe it or not. In 1939, the U.S. Army was smaller than the Army of Portugal. The U.S. was an isolationist nation, trying desperately to ignore the storm clouds gathering over Europe and Asia. But across the Atlantic, the storm broke, and when the war finally kicked into gear, it triggered the greatest economic transformation in human history. But here is the catch. It wasn't just about building tanks, it was about where those tanks were being built. Segment 2. The geography cheat code. Let's talk about the most obvious advantage, something we often overlook because it just seems like lines on a map. Geography. When the war started, the United States had the ultimate strategic cheat code. Two massive oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. These weren't just water. They were vast, impenetrable moats protecting the American homeland. Now, I want you to imagine Europe in the early 1940s. Close your eyes and really picture it. If you owned a factory in London, or Coventry, or Hamburg, or Stalingrad, your life was a daily gamble. You were looking up at the sky, waiting for the air raid sirens. The scale of destruction is hard for us to wrap our heads around today. Entire industrial heartlands were flattened by carpet bombing. Rail lines were twisted into metal pretzels. Ports were choked with the hulls of sunken cargo ships. The workforce, the young men needed to run the machines. They were dying by the millions on the Eastern Front or the beaches of Normandy. European agriculture was devastated. Fields were turned into mud and minefields. Livestock was slaughtered for emergency rations. Europe was starving. It was bleeding. It was systematically smashing its own ability to exist as a modern society. Now, look across the Atlantic. What was happening in Pittsburgh, or Detroit, or Los Angeles? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not a single bomb fell on an American steel mill. Not one American rail line was severed by enemy action. While European industry was being erased from the map, American industry was being supercharged by government contracts. The US didn't just have its existing factories running 24/7. They built thousands of new ones, huge, sprawling complexes, totally safe, totally secure. By 1944, the United States was producing more war material than all other nations combined. Think about the sheer math of that. More than Germany, more than Russia, more than Britain and Japan combined. They were building ships, the famous Liberty ships, faster than German U-boats could sink them. They were launching an aircraft carrier practically every month. It wasn't just that America was strong, it was that by 1945, America had the only fully functioning, large-scale industrial economy left on the entire planet. It was the last shop open in a town that had completely burned down. Segment 3. The liquidation of the British Empire. But having factories is one thing. You also need customers, and you need leverage. And this brings us to one of the most ruthless aspects of the American ascent, the dismantling of the British Empire. We like to think of the US and UK as the closest of allies, the special relationship, and militarily, they were. But economically, the US was a predator, and Britain was the prey. In 1940, Britain was standing alone against Hitler. They were desperate. They needed destroyers to protect their convoys. They needed rifles. They needed food, whatever the cost. Winston Churchill begged President Roosevelt for help, and Roosevelt said yes. But the price tag was steep. Before the famous Lend-Lease program fully kicked in, there was a period where the US demanded cold, hard assets. Take the famous destroyers for bases deal. The US gave Britain 50 old, obsolete destroyers from World War I, ships that were practically scrap metal. In exchange, the US demanded 99-year rent-free leases on British military bases across the globe, from Newfoundland to the Caribbean. Think about that trade. 50 rusty ships for a global network of military power that would last a century. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a pawnshop deal. Britain had no choice. They signed the papers, but it didn't stop there. To pay for American supplies, Britain was forced to liquidate its foreign investments. For a century, Britain had been the world's banker. They owned railroads in Argentina, mines in Africa, factories in Asia. The US essentially said, if you want weapons to fight the Nazis, you need to sell those assets to us at fire sale prices. Wall Street investors scooped up the jewels of the British Empire for pennies on the dollar. By the time the war ended, Britain was bankrupt. They had spent their blood and their treasure fighting fascism, and the United States had quietly, legally, and systematically stripped them of their financial empire. Segment 4. The Great Gold Heist. But if you think that's wild, wait until you hear about the gold. This is the part that really tends to surprise people, because we aren't talking about digital numbers on a screen. We are talking about physical, heavy, yellow gold bars. As the Nazi war machine marched across Europe, panic set in. Governments in Paris, in Brussels, in Oslo, they knew that if the Nazis took the capital, they would loot the national treasuries. So, the Great Movement began. Under the cover of darkness, tons of gold were loaded onto trucks, then trains, and finally, onto ships. But where could they go? Where was the only safe vault in the world? The United States. Gold from France. Gold from Britain. Gold from occupied nations. It was all sent across the submarine-infested Atlantic. Some of it was sent to pay for weapons. Some of it was sent just for safekeeping. But the result was the same. The gold ended up in the vaults of the Federal Reserve in New York. And eventually much of it went to Fort Knox. This was one of the greatest transfers of wealth in human history. Before the war, the US had a healthy amount of gold. By the end of the war, the United States held nearly 2/3 of the entire world's known monetary gold reserves. Yes, you heard that right. 2/3. The rest of the world had practically zero hard currency left. Europe had bankrupted itself, and the United States was sitting on a literal mountain of bullion. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the hidden history of the war, please take a quick second to hit the like button. It really helps the algorithm show this to more people who want to know the truth. And if you want to see more content like this, consider subscribing. Okay, let's get back to it. Segment 5. The brain drain. So we have industrial dominance. We have the destruction of rivals. We have the gold. But the destruction of Europe handed America something perhaps even more valuable than metal: minds. We have to remember that for centuries, Europe was the center of scientific and intellectual gravity. German universities were the envy of the world in physics and chemistry. The Nobel Prizes were dominated by Europeans. But starting in the 1930s, a shadow fell over the continent: the rise of Nazism, the persecution of Jewish intellectuals, the sheer chaos of impending war. It created a tidal wave of refugees. But these weren't just any refugees. These were some of the smartest human beings who have ever walked the earth: Albert Einstein, Enrico Fermi, Niels Bohr. They fled the burning building of Europe. And where did they run? To the stability and the funding of America. But this gets a little darker. It wasn't just the refugees who fled voluntarily. As the war ended, the US military launched something called Operation Paperclip. They knew that Germany had developed incredible technology: jet engines, V-2 rockets, advanced chemical weapons. The US government actively recruited, and in some cases secretly smuggled, Nazi scientists to America. Men like Werner von Braun. He was a member of the SS. He built rockets using slave labor. But America needed his brain, so they scrubbed his record. They gave him a job, and he went on to build the Saturn V rocket that took Americans to the moon. America inherited centuries of European institutional knowledge almost overnight. These were the minds that fueled the Manhattan Project, that built the foundations of the space race, that kick-started the post-war technology boom. Europe's intellectual suicide became America's intellectual windfall. Segment 6. The checkmate. Bretton-Woods. So it is 1944. The war isn't even fully over yet. The fighting is still raging in France and the Pacific. But the outcome is clear. The Allies are going to win. But the world looks very different than it did 5 years ago. Europe is ruin. Its cities are rubble. Its treasuries are empty. Its populations are traumatized. The Soviet Union has lost 20 million people, and its Western industrial core is annihilated. And then there is the United States, rich, untouched, holding all the gold, with an industrial machine humming like nothing history has ever seen. Now, here is the rule of geopolitics. If you hold all the cards, you get to make the rules. And in July 1944, at a quiet hotel in Bretton-Woods, New Hampshire, America decided to set the rules for the new world order. Delegates from 44 nations gathered to decide how the post-war global economy would work. But let's be real. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a coronation. The famous British economist John Maynard Keynes was there. He had an idea for a fair global currency. He called it the Bancor. It wouldn't belong to any one country. It would be neutral. It would prevent any one nation from dominating the others. It was a smart idea, a fair idea. And the United States crushed it. The American delegate, Harry Dexter White, essentially said, "No, we have the gold. We have the economy. We are going to use the dollar." And because Britain and France were drowning in debt to the US, they had to agree. The Bretton-Woods Agreement was signed, and the crux of it was revolutionary. The US dollar was officially crowned the world's reserve currency. The dollar would be backed by gold at $35 an ounce because, remember, America had all the gold anyway, and every other currency in the world. The British pound, the French franc, the Italian lira would be pegged to the US dollar. Think about the power that gives you. It means if France wanted to buy oil, or if Brazil wanted to trade with Japan, they essentially had to do the math through the US dollar. It made the greenback the oxygen of global commerce. It gave the United States immense, unprecedented control over the global financial system, control that it still largely holds today. They didn't just win the game. They redesigned the board so they could never really lose again. Segment 7. The Marshall Plan. Charity or strategy? But there was still a massive problem in 1945. A problem that threatened to undo everything. America had this massive industrial machine. It could build refrigerators and cars and radios and washing machines faster than anyone imagined possible. But who was going to buy them? The American consumer could only buy so much. And Europe? Europe couldn't afford to buy a toaster, let alone a fleet of American cars. Their economies had ceased to function. Their currency was worthless. People were using banknotes to start fires to keep warm. This was the dollar gap. Europe needed American goods to survive, but they had no dollars to pay for them. If Europe remained broken, the American economic engine would stall. The factories would close. The Great Depression would come back. And even worse, a starving, desperate Europe might turn to the Soviet Union for help. Communism was looking very appealing to hungry people in France and Italy, so America did something unprecedented, something that is often taught in school as a grand act of purely moral charity: the Marshall Plan. The US officially gifted billions of dollars, trillions in today's money, to help rebuild Western Europe. They rebuilt ports, they fixed rail lines, they modernized factories. Now, don't get me wrong, it was generous, and it saved millions of people from starvation and poverty. But here is the catch. It was also a brilliant, cynical strategy. The Marshall Plan money came with strings attached. A huge chunk of that money had to be spent buying goods from American companies. It was a stimulus package for the American economy, laundered through Europe. We gave them the money to buy our stuff. It kept the American factories humming, and more importantly, it integrated Europe into the American system. In rebuilding Europe, America rebuilt it in its own image, consumerist, capitalist, and utterly dependent on the American economic system. They didn't just rebuild a continent, they built a loyal customer base. Segment 8, Cultural Dominance. And once the economic dominance was secured, the cultural dominance followed naturally. This is the part we see in the movies. Because Europe was rebuilding, their film industries were shattered. Their clothing industries were gone. So, American movies flooded European cinemas. American music played on the radios. Coca-Cola became a symbol of freedom. Blue jeans became the uniform of the youth. This wasn't an accident. It was soft power. When you are the only rich guy in the room, everyone starts to dress like you. Everyone wants to be like you. The American dream became the global dream, not necessarily because it was superior, but because it was the only dream being broadcast in high definition while everyone else was staring at a blank screen. Conclusion: the last man standing. So let's zoom out. When you look back at the speed of the transformation, it is dizzying. In 1939, the US was a sleeping middle power, struggling with depression. Isolationist. 6 years later, it owns half the world's manufacturing capacity. It holds most of the world's gold. Its currency is the global standard. Its navy rules every ocean. And it is the sole possessor of the atomic bomb. It was a hyperpower, a level of dominance that Rome or the Mongols could only dream of. We like to tell ourselves that this happened because of American ideals, because freedom is just better. And look, those ideals, they are important. Democracy is important. But ideals didn't build the B-29 bomber. Ideals didn't fill Fort Knox with gold bullion. And ideals didn't force the British Empire to sell its assets. The uncomfortable truth of the 20th century is that America's ascent wasn't a miracle. It was the result of a catastrophic subtraction elsewhere. The world blew itself up, and the United States was the only major power standing at a safe distance. They sold the dynamite while the war raged, and then they sold the bricks to rebuild the ruins when the smoke cleared. It's a stark reminder that history isn't a fairy tale of good versus evil. It's a brutal game of resources, geography, and leverage. And the superpower we know today was born from the ashes of a burning world. Thanks for watching.